She asked for nothing but a plate of food, never knowing the man who answered was the ghost from her past. It began with a knock on the door of one of the city's most powerful men. Behind the gates of his glass-walled mansion lived Walter Miller, tech billionaire, heir to a legendary fortune, and a man who had everything money could buy. But on that scorching afternoon, he opened his door to a stranger, or so he thought. A weary woman stood there, holding the hand of a frightened little girl. She asked for nothing more than food and a safe place to sleep. Within moments, Walter's carefully constructed life unraveled. Because the woman wasn't a stranger at all, and the child, with eyes identical to his own, carried a secret that would shatter his world forever. The morning sun, a brilliant and unforgiving white, poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Walter's mansion, flooding the living room with a stark, revealing light. For most, it would have been a beautiful day. For Walter, it was just another day of clarity, another day where the emptiness of his life was laid bare. Each ray of sunlight seemed to be a spotlight on the invisible dust dancing in the air, on the absence of laughter, on the monumental silence of the house. Today the silence was even heavier. It was the anniversary of his grandfather's death, a man who was more of a father to him than his own. General Miller, a legendary veteran of wars Walter had only read about in history books, had been the moral compass of his life. A large, stoic portrait of the general in full-dress uniform hung above the marble fireplace, his gaze firm and unwavering, a constant reminder of a legacy Walter felt he could never live up to. Walter stood before the portrait, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the ice clinking softly, the only sound in the vast room. He had inherited the general's fortune, his mansion, his name, but not his honor, not his peace. Walter had multiplied the fortune tenfold, turning the family's old money inheritance into a modern tech empire. He had everything a man could want, yet he was haunted by a ghost from his past, a ghost more real to him than the flesh and blood people who moved in and out of his life. He closed his eyes, and the memory, his most faithful enemy, assaulted him. He saw himself at 22, a skinny kid with calloused hands and dreams bigger than his pockets. And he saw Eleanor, with her long, dark hair, her sun-kissed skin, and a smile that seemed to carry all the light in the world. They were sitting on the hood of his beat-up pickup truck, sharing a bottle of cheap soda, planning a life they would never have. Their love was the only valuable thing they possessed. It was a desperate love, forged in poverty, a small boat in an ocean of difficulties. Then came the opportunity. A scholarship to a prestigious university, a tech internship that promised the impossible. It was his only chance to escape the life of manual labor that awaited him, the same life that had broken his father. The farewell was the hardest thing he had ever done. "I'll come back, Ellie," he had promised, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I swear on everything I hold sacred. I'll study, get a good job, and I'll come back for us." "Promises are just words, Walt," she had replied, her eyes full of tears that refused to fall. "The world out there is big. It swallows people like us. It won't swallow me, and I will never forget you." He had kissed her one last time, the taste of her lips mixed with the salt of her tears. He got on the bus and looked back, engraving the image of her, standing in the dust of the bus station, waving until she became a dot on the horizon. The world did, in fact, swallow him. The city, with its speed, its ambition, its promise of power, was a whirlwind. He worked, he studied, he slept little. He met people who saw in him the same hunger that drove them. The promise he had made to Eleanor became a distant memory, a dream from another life, covered by the reality of contracts, spreadsheets, and the cold glow of success. He told himself that Eleanor deserved someone better, someone who wouldn't make her wait. He told himself that she would have already forgotten him. And with that lie, he built his empire and his new life on the grave of his first and only true love. The sound of the doorbell startled him out of his memories, a sharp, insistent sound that broke the sanctity of his morning. His housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a stern woman who had been loyal to his grandfather and now ran the house with military efficiency, was not there. It was her day off. Annoyed by the intrusion, Walter crossed the entrance hall. Whoever it was would be dismissed coldly. He opened the door impatiently. The midday sun blinded him for a moment. When his eyes adjusted, he saw the scene that would define the rest of his life. Standing on his doorstep, under the harsh sun, was a woman. She looked as if she had stepped out of one of his most painful memories. She was thin, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, her face marked by a deep weariness. She held the hand of a girl of perhaps 7 or 8, with dark hair and frightened eyes, who hid behind her mother's legs. Both wore simple clothes, clean but visibly worn. The woman raised her face, and Walter's heart stopped. Even with the lines of worry, with the weathered skin, with the glow of youth gone, he recognized her. It was like being struck by lightning. Eleanor. She, however, did not recognize him. The man she had known was a skinny boy with rough hands and windblown hair. The man before her was a fortress, older, stronger, his hair cut with precision, his face clean-shaven, wearing clothes that cost more than she earned in a year. To her, he was just a rich stranger, the owner of that house that looked like an unattainable palace. Moved by the desperation that had brought her there, she spoke, her voice low and trembling, but filled with the strength of a lioness fighting for her cub. "Sir, good morning. Forgive my boldness in knocking on your door. My name is Eleanor. My daughter and we're going through a very difficult time. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for a chance, a job, anything." She looked at the impeccable facade of the house, at the perfectly manicured gardens. "I saw the size of your house. I thought maybe you needed someone to help with the cleaning. I'm a very hard worker. I can wash, iron, cook, take care of the garden, whatever is needed. I don't need a salary, sir, just a plate of food for both of us and a safe place for her to sleep tonight." Walter was physically unable to respond. Her words were a distorted echo of their old dreams, in our house, with our life. And there she was, asking to clean his house for food. Guilt was a poison rising in his throat, suffocating him. 12 years of success, of wealth, of power. It all unraveled in that instant, revealing the man he really was. A deserter, a liar, the architect of the misery of the only woman he had ever loved. "Ellie," he managed to whisper, his voice a broken sound, unrecognizable even to himself. Upon hearing her name, spoken with a familiarity that did not belong to that man, that house, that life, Eleanor finally looked at him with attention. She searched his face, his eyes, and under the billionaire's mask, she began to see the features of the boy who haunted her nights, the shape of his eyes, the way his mouth curved, even in pain. Her jaw dropped. The air escaped her lungs in a gasp of shock and horror. Her eyes filled with an old pain, with a betrayal that time had not healed. "No, it can't be," she stammered, taking a step back, pulling her daughter with her. But it was the little girl who sealed their fate. Frightened by the tension between the adults, the little girl lifted her face and looked at Walter. And he saw his own eyes. The same color, the same shape, the same intensity. It was like looking in a mirror of time. He looked at the girl, a girl of 7 or 8. He had left 9 years ago. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. The child on his doorstep, hungry, scared, was not just the daughter of the woman he had abandoned. She was his daughter. Walter's world shattered into a million pieces. The pain for his grandfather's death, the guilt for having abandoned Eleanor, the shock of discovering a daughter, all converged into a single point of unbearable agony. There on the doorstep of his empty mansion, under the harsh sun, he was not Walter Miller, the tech titan. He was just Walt, the poor boy, who had made a promise and broken it in the most devastating way possible. And the past he had tried to bury under a mountain of money had come to collect its debt. And the debt had his eyes. The name, Walt, whispered with the voice of a ghost, broke the spell that had paralyzed Walter. That nickname, a relic of a life he had tried to bury under 12 years of success and concrete, brought him back to the brutal reality of his doorstep. Before him, Eleanor trembled, her face pale with shock, the old hatred and the pain of betrayal warring in her eyes. She had recognized him, and the recognition brought no joy, but an even deeper horror. I didn't know it was you," she stammered, taking another step back, the instinct to flee stronger than the desperation that had brought her there. She squeezed her daughter, Chloe, against her chest, as if to protect her from him, from that man who was the personification of all her broken promises. "Forget what I said. It was a mistake. Let's go, honey." She turned, ready to plunge back into the street, to face hunger and uncertainty, Anything not to have to accept the pity of the man who had destroyed her life. The humiliation of asking a stranger for food was nothing compared to the humiliation of asking him. No, Walter's voice sounded, a command born of the pure panic of losing her again. He stepped forward and, without thinking, grabbed her arm. The touch was electric, a current of 12 years of unresolved history passing between them. Please, don't go. Come in. It's a hot day, the girl. She needs water, a place to rest. The words came out clumsy, stupid. He, a master of negotiation, a man who could move markets with a single sentence, now couldn't form a coherent thought. His mind was chaos. Eleanor there, and the girl who had his eyes, his daughter. The word echoed in his mind like a cathedral bell. Deafening. Daughter. I don't want your help. Walter. Eleanor spat, trying to pull away. The force in her voice was the force of a decade of pent-up anger. I didn't need you for 9 years. I don't need you now. I'd rather beg on the street than accept anything from you. Those words were like knives, each one digging deeper into his guilt. But it was the child who broke her resistance. Chloe, awakened by the tension, began to cry. A weak, tired cry, the cry of a sick and hungry child. Mommy, my tummy hurts, she murmured, her little face hot against Eleanor's neck. In that instant, the battle within Eleanor ended. Her pride, her anger, her pain. Everything bowed before the primary need of her child. She looked at Chloe's tearful face and then at the man before her. And in her eyes, he saw defeat, the surrender of a mother who would do anything for her child, even accept the help of her greatest ghost. Without another word, Walter guided her inside. As he closed the heavy door, he felt as if he were closing a portal to the past, locking it inside with him. The silence of the mansion seemed even more oppressive with their presence. The journey of Eleanor and Chloe into that place was a collision of worlds. They walked through the entrance hall, Eleanor's feet leaving dusty marks on the impeccable marble. Chloe, who had stopped crying, now looked at everything with wide eyes, her mouth half open. She had never seen a ceiling so high, a floor that shone, a space so vast and empty. It was like entering a museum or a church. Sit down, please, Walter said, pointing to a white leather sofa that probably cost more than all the houses Eleanor had ever rented in her life. He felt like a stranger in his own home, a clumsy host for the ghost he had just invited in. He ran to the kitchen, a stainless steel and high-tech environment he barely used, and returned with a glass of water and a glass of milk. He handed the milk to Eleanor. For her, he said, his voice still unsteady. Eleanor took the glass, her hands trembling. She helped Chloe drink, and the girl drank the milk with an eagerness that broke Walter's heart into 1,000 pieces. While the child drank, Eleanor looked around, saw the expensive paintings on the walls, the sculptures, the designer furniture. Each object was a testament to his success, to the life he had built without her. Each luxury item was a brick in the wall he had erected between the past and the present, a wall that had now crumbled. She felt small, dirty, an intruder in that sanctuary of wealth. It was at that moment that a new figure entered the scene. Mr. Higgins, the butler and head of security, had returned early from his day off. He entered the living room and stopped, petrified, at the scene. His face, normally a mask of impassive professionalism, contorted into an expression of shock and disapproval. "Sir," he said, his voice cold, his eyes moving from Walter to Eleanor and the child, as if analyzing a threat. "Are you all right, sir? Who are these people?" The word people was said with a restrained contempt that made Eleanor flinch. For Higgins, a man whose life was dedicated to protecting Walter from any complications, from any remnant of his undesirable past, the presence of those two was a fire alarm. He saw a con artist, a woman from the past who had appeared to exploit her employer's wealth and loneliness. "It's all right, Higgins. They are my guests," Walter replied, the word guests sounding strange in his own mouth. "Please, prepare a guest room, the best we have, and ask the kitchen to prepare a light soup, chicken broth, and some fruit." Quickly, Higgins stared at him, the disapproval clear in his eyes. "As you wish, sir," he said with a stiff bow before retreating, but the message was clear. He was the guardian of the castle, and he would not accept those intruders easily. His presence added a new layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. With Chloe's most immediate need being taken care of, the silence returned between them, heavy and full of unasked questions. Chloe, exhausted, fell asleep again in Eleanor's lap. Walter watched her, his heart a mixture of pain and terrifying fascination. His daughter was there, feet away from him, and he was a complete stranger to her. "We need to talk," he said finally. He led her to the library, the same place where hours before he had contemplated his loneliness. He let her sit in a soft armchair while he remained standing, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He didn't know where to start. "I'm sorry" seemed like a joke. What happened was too cruel. "How did you find me?" he asked, the first question that came to his mind. "I didn't find you. I wasn't looking for you," she replied, her voice still full of a cold anger. "I was just looking for a roof, a place to spend the night. My daughter is sick. We were evicted from the little room where we lived yesterday. The owner needed the place. I walked all day. I knocked on dozens of doors. No one gave me a chance. And then I saw this house and thought, whoever lives here has so much that they won't miss a little food." She laughed, a bitter laugh. "What irony, isn't it? Of all the doors in the world, I came knocking on yours." Her story was a succession of blows for Walter. Evicted, hungry, her daughter sick. Every word was an accusation, a reminder of his monumental failure. "Eleanor, he began. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "You didn't know?" she interrupted him, her eyes flashing. "Of course you didn't know. How could you know from the top of your castle? You disappeared, Walt. You promised me you would come back. I waited. I wrote you dozens of letters that came back with a return to sender stamp. I looked for you. And you? You just vanished, built your empire, and left me behind as if I were a piece of trash from your old life." The torrent of pain and resentment of 12 years came to the surface. "I was young, foolish. I believed you. And when I needed you most, when I found out..." She stopped, swallowing hard, looking instinctively towards the door, as if to make sure Chloe was still asleep. It was the moment, the question that hung between them, the truth he already felt in his bones. "When you found out what, Ellie?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "The girl? Chloe, is she?" He couldn't finish. The question was too big, too heavy. Eleanor stared at him, and in her eyes was all the contempt in the world. "Yes, Walter," she said, her voice as hard as a diamond. "She is your daughter. The daughter you never knew existed because you were too busy becoming the king of the world. I found out I was pregnant a month after you left. I tried to tell you in every way, but you had already discarded me. My family turned their backs on me. They call me a disgrace. I raised her alone, every day, every night, cleaning other people's floors, washing dishes, doing whatever it took so that she would never go hungry, so that she would have a minimum of dignity, the dignity that her father denied her." The verbal confirmation was the final blow. Walter leaned on the table, his legs weak. His daughter, an 8-year-old daughter, a whole life he had missed. The first step, the first tooth, the first word, the birthdays, the night fears, the fevers. He hadn't been there for anything. He had been an absent father, a ghost who didn't even know of his own existence. He looked at Eleanor, at the face of a woman who should have shared a life of joy with him, but who instead had carried the burden of both of them alone. Her strength, her resilience, the unwavering love that had kept her going, all of it crushed him. He was not worthy of even being in the same room with her. He tried to speak, but there were no words. What could he say? Apologies were insults, justifications were lies. All that was left was the naked truth of his failure. The status quo of that house had been permanently broken. There, under the same roof, were 3 people united by blood and separated by an abyss of pain and time. Walter, the father who had just discovered his daughter. Eleanor, the mother who would never forgive him. And Chloe, the innocent girl who slept in a luxury room, oblivious to the fact that the rich stranger who had taken her in was the father she had never known. Walter walked to the guest room door, opened it silently. The light from the hallway illuminated the scene. Chloe slept, a small figure lost in a huge bed of silk sheets. She looked like a fairy tale princess, but he knew that her life had been a nightmare, and he was the monster in the story. The question that echoed in his soul as he watched the daughter he did not know was no longer, what happened? It was a much more terrifying one. What do I do now? He could give her a castle, but he didn't know how to give her a home. He could give her the world, but he didn't know how to be her father. Walter's journey was just beginning, and the road ahead was a minefield of guilt, resentment, and the fragile, almost impossible, hope of redemption. The next morning, the sun once again filled the mansion with its indifferent light. But today, the silence was different. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of unspoken words, of a tension so thick it felt like a physical presence. Walter hadn't slept. He had spent the night in an armchair in the library, staring at the portrait of his grandfather, the general's stern gaze offering no answers, only judgment. For the first time, Walter felt the immense weight of his wealth not as a shield, but as a cage. He had built a fortress to protect himself from his past, and now the past was inside, sleeping in one of his guest rooms. He ordered the kitchen staff, who had arrived in the early morning, to prepare a simple breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit, milk. Food for a child. He felt a ridiculous and profound anxiety. What did a 7-year-old girl eat for breakfast? Did she like her toast cut into squares or triangles? The questions were absurd, but they were the only ones his mind, accustomed to dealing with multi-million-dollar mergers, could formulate. When Eleanor and Chloe came down, the scene was set in the small dining room, a room Walter never used, which he now thought was cozier than the cavernous main dining hall. Eleanor was wearing the same worn clothes as the day before, but she had washed her face and tied her hair back. She looked tired, but her eyes were firm, guarded. Chloe, holding her mother's hand, looked small and overwhelmed. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, also clean but faded. She looked a little better. The rest seemed to have done her good, but there was still a fragility about her, a paleness that worried Walter. "Good morning," Walter said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. Eleanor just nodded, avoiding his gaze. She helped Chloe into a chair, a large chair that made the girl look even smaller. Mr. Higgins entered at that moment, carrying a tray. He served the food with a stony expression, placing a plate in front of Chloe with a little more force than necessary. The clatter of the porcelain made the girl flinch. "Higgins, be more careful," Walter said, his voice sharp. "My apologies, sir," Higgins replied, his tone devoid of any real regret. He looked at Eleanor as if she were a stain on the fine fabric of the house. The butler's hostility was a physical thing, a cold front that filled the room. The breakfast was a torturous affair. Walter tried to make conversation, asking Chloe simple questions. "Do you like school? What's your favorite color?" Chloe just nodded or shook her head, whispering her answers to her mother, who would then repeat them. It was a painful triangle of communication, with Eleanor as the reluctant interpreter. Eleanor ate little, her body tense, as if ready to grab Chloe and run at any moment. After the ordeal of breakfast, Walter decided to act. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems. And the problem, as he saw it, was that his daughter and the woman he had wronged had nothing. He would fix that. He made a call. An hour later, 2 elegant women and several men carrying large boxes and clothing racks arrived at the mansion. He had called the most exclusive personal shopping service in the city. He led Eleanor and Chloe to the main living room, where the team had already set up a veritable pop-up boutique. Racks of colorful dresses, rows of shiny shoes, tables laden with toys, dolls, books, art supplies. It was a child's paradise. I thought Chloe might need a few things," Walter said, a nervous, almost proud smile on his face. He expected gratitude, perhaps even a thaw in Eleanor's icy demeanor. He had expected a child's cry of joy. He got neither. Chloe's eyes widened, but it wasn't with joy. It was with fear. The sheer volume of things, the presence of strangers, the overwhelming opulence of it all, was too much for her. She hid behind Eleanor's legs again, her little body trembling. Eleanor looked at the scene, at the mountain of merchandise, at Walter's expectant face. And something inside her snapped. The fragile truce of the last few hours shattered. Her eyes, which had been dull with exhaustion, now blazed with a fire that Walter remembered well, a fire he had once loved and now feared. "What is this, Walter?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "It's for Chloe. For you too. Clothes, whatever you need. Just choose," he stammered, his smile faltering. "Choose," she repeated, and then she laughed. It was the same bitter laugh from the night before, a sound full of pain and scorn. "Do you really think that's how it works? You think you can just throw money at us and fix everything? You think a few dresses and dolls can erase 12 years of absence? 12 years of struggle. She stepped forward, her voice rising with every word, ignoring the bewildered looks of the shopping assistants. For 12 years, I've mended her clothes until my fingers bled. I've searched through thrift stores to find her a decent coat for the winter. I've gone hungry so she could have a second helping. Each of her worn-out shoes tells a story, Walter, a story of survival, a story you weren't a part of. And you think you can just replace those stories with a price tag? The personal shoppers began to back away, sensing the deeply personal and volatile nature of the storm that had just erupted. Higgins, who was observing from the doorway, had a small, triumphant smile on his lips. That's not what I meant, Walter tried to explain, his face pale. I just wanted to help. Help? She shot back, her voice now a raw cry of pain. You want to help? Where were you when she had a fever of 104 in the middle of the night, and I had to walk 3 miles to the emergency room because I didn't have money for a taxi? Where were you when she cried on her first day of school because all the other kids had a dad to take their picture? Where were you on her birthdays, Walter? She would make a wish blowing out a single candle on a cupcake I could barely afford, and I know she was always wishing for the same thing. A father. The words hit him like physical blows. He staggered back, the reality of his negligence laid bare in the most brutal way. The grand gesture, which in his mind had been an act of generosity, was now revealed for what it was, a clumsy, arrogant attempt to quiet his own guilt. An insult. You don't get to do this. Eleanor continued, tears now streaming down her face, the tears of a decade of solitude and struggle. You don't get to be Santa Claus. You don't get to buy your redemption. If you want to be in her life, you have to earn it. You have to face the mess you made. You have to look her in the eye and explain where you've been. You have to build a bridge, not pave a road with gold. She doesn't need your things, Walter. She needed a father. And you weren't there. She turned to the stunned assistants. Thank you, but we don't need any of this. Please, take it all away. Then she took Chloe's hand, who was now crying silently, and walked out of the room, leaving Walter standing alone in the middle of a museum of his own failure, surrounded by colorful trinkets that had never seemed so gray and lifeless. The silence that fell after they left was absolute. The assistants, embarrassed and uncomfortable, quickly and quietly began to pack everything up. Walter didn't move. He stood there, a statue of regret, listening to the echo of Eleanor's words. She needed a father. And you weren't there. He finally understood. He couldn't fix the past with money. Money was the reason he had lost them in the first place. He had chosen the pursuit of wealth over the promise of love. He remembered the last letter he had received from her, one of the few that had managed to find him in his early days at university. She told him about her struggles, about her loneliness. And he, immersed in his new world, full of ambition and the fear of failure, had seen her letter as an anchor, a weight that would pull him back to the poverty he was so desperate to escape. So he cut the rope. He moved, changed his address without telling her, and justified his cowardice with the lie that it was for her own good. He had convinced himself that she would be better off without him. A lie he had repeated to himself for 12 years, a lie that had now been pulverized. Later that day, a fragile peace settled over the house. Eleanor had locked herself in her room with Chloe. Walter paced his library like a wounded animal. He knew he had to do something different, something real. But he didn't know what. He was an expert in business strategy, not in matters of the heart. It was late in the afternoon when he heard a soft knock on the library door. It was Eleanor. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was resolute. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice flat. "It's not right. I appreciate the shelter, but this is your world, not ours. We'll leave in the morning." "No," Walter said, his voice firm. "You can't leave. Chloe, she's my daughter. I want to be a part of her life. I know I have no right to ask, but I am asking. Don't go." "And what does that mean, Walter? What does being a part of her life mean to you? A check every month? A trust fund? A driver to take her to a fancy private school?" It means I want to know her," he said, the words feeling foreign and real at the same time. "I want to know her favorite food, her favorite song. I want to help her with her homework. I want to be there when she's sick. I want to be a father. I know I don't know how, but I want to learn. Please, Eleanor, give me a chance. Not for me, for her." He was pleading, something he hadn't done since he was a child. He was stripped of his power, his money, his confidence. He was just a man begging for a chance to fix the biggest mistake of his life. Eleanor looked at him for a long time, her face an unreadable mask. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the war between her pride and her maternal instinct. She knew that Walter could give Chloe a life of stability and opportunity that she never could. But she also knew the price of that stability could be her daughter's heart. Before she could answer, a small, weak voice called from the hallway. "Mommy." Chloe was standing in the doorway, looking pale and feverish. She was shivering despite the warmth of the house. "Mommy, I don't feel good." She took a few unsteady steps towards Eleanor, and then her legs gave way. She collapsed to the floor. "Chloe!" Eleanor screamed, rushing to her daughter's side. Walter froze for a second in panic. Then his instincts took over. He scooped the small, limp body into his arms. Her skin was burning hot. "Higgins!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the mansion. "Get the car. We're going to the hospital. Now." As he ran out of the house with his unconscious daughter in his arms, with Eleanor right behind him, crying his name, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. All the money in the world meant nothing if he couldn't save the little girl he had just found. The battle for his redemption had just begun, and it would not be fought in a boardroom, but in the sterile, unforgiving corridors of a hospital. The powerful engine of the black sedan roared to life, a stark contrast to the terrifying silence that had fallen inside the car. Walter sat in the back, holding Chloe's small, feverish body in his arms. She felt terrifyingly light, as if she were made of nothing but air and heat. Eleanor was beside him, her face a mask of pale terror, her hand resting on Chloe's forehead, as if her touch alone could will the fever away. She was murmuring the child's name over and over, a desperate prayer. Up front, Higgins drove with a cold, efficient fury. He navigated the city's streets with practiced skill, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. But his face, reflected in the rearview mirror, was a storm of conflicting emotions. Disapproval was still there, but it was now mixed with a grudging sense of duty and perhaps a flicker of alarm. The chaos he had so feared had not just entered the mansion. It was now racing through the streets in his employer's car. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. Walter, accustomed to having doors open for him, found himself in the chaotic democracy of the emergency room. For a moment, he was just another desperate person in a crowd of sick and injured people. But money, he quickly remembered, had its own language. He approached the reception desk, his voice a low, urgent command. "I need a private room. The best doctor you have. Now." He didn't wait for an answer, simply placed his black credit card on the counter. The effect was instantaneous. Nurses began to move with a new urgency. Forms were pushed aside. A doctor was paged. They were ushered into a private wing, a quiet, sterile sanctuary away from the main emergency room. Chloe was placed on a bed, and a team of doctors and nurses immediately surrounded her, attaching monitors, drawing blood, their movements efficient and impersonal. Walter and Eleanor were pushed to the side, suddenly helpless spectators. The waiting began. They sat in uncomfortable chairs in a small, sterile family room. The adrenaline of the past hour had faded, leaving behind a heavy, gnawing dread. The silence between them was no longer angry, but fragile, stretched thin by shared fear. Walter found himself looking at Eleanor, truly looking at her for the first time not as a ghost from his past or an accuser, but as the mother of his child, a woman who was in agony. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled in her lap. He saw the fierce, unconditional love that had kept her and their daughter alive for all these years. And he felt a profound, soul-crushing shame. "This is my fault," he said, the words torn from him. "Her being sick, it's because of me. Because of what I put you through." Eleanor looked up, her eyes empty. "It's not your fault she has a fever, Walter. Children get sick." But she hesitated, the truth too heavy to be left unsaid. The doctor in the free clinic said she was anemic, malnourished. He said her immune system was weak. That's why every cold she catches turns into something worse. "So yes," she said, her voice breaking, "the fact that we were living in a damp, cold room, the fact that I couldn't always afford the freshest food, that part is your fault." The accusation, delivered not with anger but with a devastating weariness, was worse than any shout. Walter had no defense. He could only absorb the truth of her words. He had built an empire, yet his daughter was malnourished. The irony was so cruel, it was almost a physical pain. Hours crawled by. Higgins appeared at the door, a silent, imposing figure. "Sir, I have brought a change of clothes for you." "And for the madam," he said, the word madam sounding forced and unnatural on his lips. He held out a bag from an expensive department store. It was a practical gesture, but in that moment, it felt like another intrusion, another reminder of the chasm between their worlds. "We don't need it, Higgins," Walter said, his voice flat. "Just wait outside. Please." Higgins bowed stiffly and retreated, his disapproval radiating from his rigid back. Finally, a doctor entered the room. She was an older woman with kind, tired eyes. "Mr. Miller? Mrs. Miller?" she began, using the name on the admission forms. Eleanor flinched but didn't correct her. "I'm Dr. Evans," she continued. "We've run some tests. Your daughter has a severe case of pneumonia. It's quite advanced. Her system is very weak, which is why it's hitting her so hard. We've started her on a course of strong antibiotics, and she's on oxygen. The next 48 hours will be critical." "Critical," Eleanor whispered, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. "It means we need to watch her closely," Dr. Evans explained gently. "Her fever is very high, and we need to bring it down. She's a fighter, but she has a tough battle ahead of her." The news settled over them, a cold, heavy blanket. Pneumonia, malnourished, critical. The words hammered at Walter. He felt a helplessness he had never known. He could buy companies, influence markets, bend the world to his will. But he couldn't fight the bacteria invading his daughter's lungs. He couldn't command her fever to break. He was allowed to see her. He stood by her bed in the intensive care unit, looking at the small figure lost in a tangle of tubes and wires. A monitor beeped a steady, rhythmic pulse, the only sound in the room. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her hair. It was soft, just as he had imagined. In that moment, watching his daughter fight for her life, something inside him shifted. The guilt, the shame, the regret, they were all still there. But now, they were joined by something new, something fierce and powerful, a father's love. A desperate, protective instinct that overshadowed everything else. He made a decision. He turned to Eleanor, who was standing on the other side of the bed, her face buried in her hands. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm staying here. With her." Eleanor looked up, surprised. "Walter, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "I've missed the first 7 years of her life. I'm not missing another minute." And so, the sterile hospital room became their world. Walter had a comfortable cot brought in for Eleanor and a reclining chair for himself. He canceled all his meetings, ignored the frantic calls from his office that Higgins kept reporting. His multi-billion-dollar empire could run itself, or it could crumble. He didn't care. His only focus was the small, fragile life tethered to the beeping machines. For 2 days, they kept vigil. They barely spoke, but a new kind of communication formed between them. A shared look when Chloe's temperature dropped a fraction of a degree. A shared sigh of relief when the doctor gave a cautiously optimistic report. They took turns sleeping, took turns watching. Eleanor would tell him small things about Chloe. That her favorite color was yellow. That she loved to draw horses. That she was afraid of the dark. Each detail was a precious gift, a piece of the puzzle of the daughter he didn't know. Higgins remained a constant, silent presence in the hallway. He brought them food they barely touched, coffee they drank to stay awake. Walter could feel the butler's judgment, his silent plea for his employer to return to his real life, to leave this messy, emotional crisis behind. But Walter ignored him. This was his real life now. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Dr. Evans came in with a smile. "She's responding to the antibiotics," she announced. "She's still very weak, but she's out of immediate danger. She's a strong little girl." The relief that washed over Walter was so immense it almost brought him to his knees. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time in 12 years, he saw a glimmer of something other than pain in her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a shared moment of profound, overwhelming relief. A shared victory. Later that evening, Chloe was moved to a regular room. She was asleep, her breathing deeper and more regular. The tubes were gone, replaced by a simple 4-drip. Walter and Eleanor sat on either side of her bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. "You should go home. Get some real sleep," Eleanor said softly. "I am home," Walter replied, his eyes never leaving Chloe's face. "This is my home now. With you too." The words hung in the air, a fragile offering. He wasn't trying to buy his way back in. He was simply stating a truth that had taken him 12 years to understand. He looked at Eleanor across the hospital bed, across the sleeping form of their daughter. The road ahead was long and uncertain. There were years of pain and distrust to overcome. But for the first time, the chasm between them didn't seem infinite. It was just a space that might, with time and patience and a whole lot of grace, be crossed. He had found his daughter, and in doing so, he was beginning to find a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. The journey of redemption had been forced upon him, but he was now, finally, ready to walk the path. The quiet that settled over the mansion in the weeks after Chloe came home from the hospital was a fragile thing. It was a silence made not of emptiness, but of careful footsteps and held breaths. Walter found himself relearning the geography of his own home, seeing it through new eyes. Corners that were once just empty space were now perfect for a game of hide-and-seek. The vast, silent living room, he discovered, had acoustics that were perfect for making ghost noises, a discovery that earned him a shriek of delighted fear from Chloe one rainy afternoon. He was clumsy. He was a man who could anticipate global market shifts, but could not, for the life of him, master the art of braiding hair. His attempts left Chloe looking like she had survived a small hurricane. He learned that a 7-year-old's logic was a thing of terrifying and beautiful mystery. Why was the sky blue? Why didn't dogs talk? Why did he live in such a big house all by himself? He answered as best he could, his answers often fumbling, but always honest. Eleanor watched him. She was a sentry at the gate of her own heart, vigilant and wary. She saw the effort, the genuine desire in his eyes to connect with the daughter he barely knew. But 12 years of bitterness was a poison that was slow to leave the system. She could not forget the nights she had walked the floor with a sick baby, alone. She could not forget the shame of asking for charity, the gnawing hunger. And so she watched, her forgiveness held in reserve, a treasure she was not yet ready to grant. The breaking point, the moment the fragile piece would either shatter or forge into something stronger, came on a Tuesday. It was a day like any other. Chloe was sitting on the floor of the formal living room, a space so pristine it seemed to cry out for a velvet rope and a do-not-touch sign. She was drawing, a box of crayons spread around her on the floor. She was focused, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she drew a family of yellow horses. A red crayon, slippery and round, escaped her grasp. It rolled across the polished floor and came to rest against the brilliant white edge of a Persian silk rug, an heirloom Walter's grandfather had brought back from his travels. It left a small, insignificant streak of wax, no bigger than a thumbnail. It was this tiny mark that brought the old world crashing into the new. Mr. Higgins entered, carrying a tray. His eyes, trained for decades to spot any imperfection, went straight to the red smudge. His posture stiffened. The tray in his hands rattled faintly. "Madam," he said, his voice low and tight, addressing Eleanor who was reading in a nearby armchair. He did not look at the child, but his disapproval was a cold wave directed at her. "An accident has occurred." Eleanor looked up, saw the red mark, and a flush of familiar shame crept up her neck. It was the shame of being poor in a rich person's house, the feeling of being an intruder, a guest who had overstayed her welcome. "Oh, I am so sorry, Mr. Higgins." "Chloe, honey, be more careful." "It was an accident, Mommy," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with fear. She looked at the red mark as if it were a wound. Higgins placed his tray on a table with a sharp, definitive click. "This rug," he began, his voice laced with the condescension of a curator scolding a troublesome tourist, "is an irreplaceable artifact. It has been in the Miller family for 3 generations. It has survived state dinners and visits from foreign dignitaries. It requires a level of care." His words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He was not talking about a rug. He was talking about belonging. He was saying, in the politest, cruelest way possible, that they did not belong, that they were the stain. Eleanor's shame curdled into a slow-burning anger. She was about to speak, to defend her daughter, but Walter's voice came from the doorway, sharp and cold as breaking glass. What, exactly, is the problem here, Higgins? Walter had been watching from the hall. He had seen the way Higgins had ignored the child, the way he had spoken down to Eleanor. He had seen the joy drain from his daughter's face, replaced by fear. A fury he hadn't felt in years, a protective rage, rose in him. He walked into the room, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power. He didn't look at Higgins. He knelt on the floor beside Chloe, his expensive suit trousers brushing against the priceless rug. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I made it dirty," she whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. Walter looked at the red streak. Then he looked at Higgins, who stood, mortified and pale, a statue of obsolete authority. Walter knew this was more than a crayon mark. It was a line drawn in the sand. He had to choose which side he was on. The side of his silent, perfect past, or the side of this messy, vibrant, unpredictable present. It wasn't a choice at all. "You didn't make it dirty," Walter said to his daughter, his voice clear and firm. "You made it better." He reached into the crayon box and pulled out a blue one. "Look, this horse you drew looks a little lonely. I think he needs a friend. Maybe a little bluebird." And then, as Higgins watched in frozen horror and Eleanor watched in stunned disbelief, Walter leaned down and drew a clumsy, simple blue bird right on the white silk of the rug. Chloe gasped. Then, a small giggle escaped her lips. A real, bubbling laugh that filled the cavernous room. It was the most beautiful sound Walter had ever heard. He stood up and faced his butler. The gentleness was gone from his face, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a man making an unbreakable decision. "This house is made of things, Higgins. Wood, stone, fabric. They are all replaceable. What is not replaceable," he said, gesturing to Eleanor and Chloe, "is my family. They are not guests. This is their home. From now on, you will treat them as the lady and the young mistress of this house. Not because I order you to, but because you understand that they are more important than any object in it. If that is something you cannot do, you may pack your things." Higgins's composure finally broke. The man who had served generals and billionaires, who had ruled this house with silent efficiency, bowed his head. It was a bow of defeat. "I understand, sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was mistaken." He then turned to Eleanor, and for the first time, looked her in the eye. "My apologies, madam. And to you, Miss Chloe." He then picked up his tray and walked out of the room, his footsteps for the first time sounding heavy, tired. That night, a new quiet settled in the house. A real peace. After Walter had tucked Chloe into bed, reading a story about a brave knight and a clever princess, he found Eleanor in the kitchen, making a cup of tea. He stood there, in the doorway, feeling like the boy he had been, wanting to say so much and knowing that words were not enough. "Ellie," he began. She turned, her face calm in the dim light. "You drew a bird on a family heirloom, Walt." There was no accusation in her voice. There was something else. "Ah, perhaps. It's just a rug," he said. "I would have set it on fire if it would have made her smile." She finally gave him a small, true smile. "I know," she said. And in those two words, a 12-year-old wall began to crumble. She poured a second cup of tea and pushed it across the counter to him. It was an invitation. A beginning. A week later, the transformation was no longer fragile. It was real. One evening, Walter was tucking Chloe into bed. The room was dark, save for a small nightlight shaped like a star. "Daddy." Chloe's small voice came from the mountain of pillows. "Yes, sweetie. Where were you before you came to live with us?" The question was simple, innocent, and it was the hardest question Walter had ever been asked. He sat on the edge of her bed, his heart pounding. He could lie. He could create a story about a long trip, about important work in a faraway land. But he looked at his daughter's trusting eyes, and he knew that the foundation of this new life had to be built on truth. "I was lost," he said, his voice quiet and thick with emotion. "For a very long time, I was a very lost man. I was looking for something I thought was important, but I was looking in all the wrong places. And I didn't know how to find my way back." "Were you in the woods?" she asked, her child's mind trying to picture it. He smiled sadly. "A different kind of woods. A woods made of tall buildings and busy schedules. A woods where it's easy to forget what really matters." He smoothed her hair back from her forehead. But then, one day, a very brave girl and her even braver mommy knocked on my door. And they gave me a map. And I found my way home. To you." Chloe's eyes grew heavy with sleep. Are you going to get lost again? She murmured. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, the promise he was about to make the most important contract of his life. No, sweetie, he whispered. I'm never going to get lost again. I'm right here. He stayed until her breathing was deep and even. When he stood up and turned, he saw Eleanor standing in the doorway. She had heard everything. Her face was wet with silent tears. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. He walked to her, and together, they stood in the hallway, looking at their sleeping daughter. He reached out and gently took her hand. She laced her fingers through his. Together, they pulled the door quietly closed, shutting out the ghosts of the past and stepping forward, finally, into the light of their shared future. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.